George versus George, The American Revolution as Seen by Both Sides, by Rosalyn Schanzer. There were once two enemies, who were both named George Washington, and the man who freed the American colonies from the British. And George III was the British king who lost them. Was King George a royal brute? American patriots say so, but others hailed him as the father of the people. Was George Washington a traitor? The king's supporters thought so, but many celebrated Washington as the father of the country. Who was right? There are two sides to every story. The year was 1763, and in many ways George Washington of America and King George III of Great Britain were very much alike. Both men had light blue eyes and reddish-brown hair, athletic and defined in appearance. Each stood well over 6 feet tall, towering above most other men during a time when the average height was 5'7". Both were honest and popular with the public. They liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to the high-fashion outfits of the period, decorated with lace ruffles and embroidery. George III was sometimes called Farmer George because of his lifelong interest in agriculture. George Washington was a farmer who was happiest when working on his land. Both were excellent horsemen and loved hunting. George III believed that a king should rule America for a long time. George Washington thought so too. He had even fought bravely alongside the British Army. The people of Great Britain and the people from Britain's American colonies had a lot in common too. Most people on both sides of the ocean liked their good-natured young patriot king. English was their main language. After all, 60% of the colonists had British ancestors. London was everybody's capital city, and many Americans proudly thought of England as home. Great Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, which involved almost every country in Europe, and extended all the way to India and Australia. King George was now the ruler of the world's greatest empire. As loyal citizens of Great Britain, colonial soldiers had joined forces with soldiers from England to fight against France for control of North America. When France gave up its territories, jubilant celebrations were held throughout both England and America. Who can imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, or that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies? Who would guess that George III would be the last king of America, and that George Washington would one day be its first president? Neither George Washington nor King George III was fully responsible for everything that happened next. Many other thinkers, soldiers, and politicians helped to shape the future. Even so, as leaders of the two sides, these two Georges were to become the strongest symbols of their countries during the next 20 years. The different ideas they stood for would soon turn the whole world upside down. A look at the life of King George and his countrymen. George III was 22 years old when he succeeded his grandfather as king in 1760. He was married to a German princess named Charlotte, and they would become the parents of 15 children. The king was absolutely devoted to his family. Their favorite home was a palace in the England countryside surrounded by roses, pinks, carnations, and orange, lemon, and tea trees. But they spent most of their time in a smaller red brick mansion called Buckingham House, usually known as the Queen's House, in London, England, the capital of Great Britain, where the king worked. London, with its 740,000 inhabitants, was the biggest city in Europe and the center of British government. London's residents were proud of their long history and high level of cultural achievement. For fun, they went to masked balls and the theater, gambled at cards, dice, and roulette, belonged to all sorts of clubs, and met at coffee houses, taverns, cockfights, chop houses, and pleasure gardens. Noisy streets teemed with horses, carriages, ballad singers, flower sellers, fishmongers, and ladies and gentlemen in fancy white wigs, wearing all the latest fashions. But the overcrowded city had its share of problems too. The death rate was high, and the coal that residents used as fuel caused black rain and thick, sooty smog. Food and drinking water were often unhealthy, riots were common, and public hangings drew rowdy mobs. Thousands of beggars and pickpockets were evidence of poverty ran amok. The English were convinced that the rest of the British Empire was backward and uncivilized. King George ruled 31 colonies and other possessions in many parts of the world, from Borneo to the Bay of Bengal, and all the way to Honduras. Throughout England, people argued constantly about world politics, but they would soon argue especially hard about the uprising over in America. Look at the life of George Washington and his countrymen. George Washington was married to a wealthy widow named Martha Curtis, tiny, outgoing, and plump. Martha was a charming hostess. More than 2,000 guests visited their Mount Vernon home in the years before 1775. Martha had 2 young children from a previous marriage, and Washington adored them. The couple enlarged Mount Vernon into an enormous self-contained community. Washington grew tobacco, then switched to wheat, besides raising mules, sheep, hogs, and prize bulls. He also bred horses and 4 hounds, knitted tons of fish, and grew such things as wild grapes, Indian corn, oats, clover, flax, hemp, and nut, apple, pears, apricot, and cherry trees. He even grew orange trees that spent the winter in his greenhouse. Gardens, shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, forestmen, and sometimes Washington's nieces and nephews all lived on the estate. Like all other plantation owners at the time, Washington was a slave owner. By 1775, he owned 135 people. About 90% of the colonists in America lived out in the country, where new arrivals from Europe were amazed to find farmland, forest, fish, and game as far as the eye could see. So much fertile territory made it possible to supply Great Britain with raw goods such as furs, flour, iron, tobacco, and lumber. In return for manufactured goods, including cloth, shoes, furniture, and tea from Great Britain. In small but bustling port cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston, whaling and shipbuilding were already major industries, and there were lumber mills, flour mills, factories, firehouses, and colleges. Streets paved most full of mud or dust overflowed with ox carts, horses, and carriages. Chimsley sweeps, sailors, and carries of wool. In local taverns, young girls danced lively jigs with their boyfriends. The most well-off, best-educated people were usually planters, like George Washington, merchants, doctors, ministers, or lawyers. Next came a very large middle class that included small farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, craftsmen, and fishermen. The poorest were unskilled laborers, indentured servants, and of course black slaves from Africa who were bought, sold, and held in bondage in all 13 of the colonies. Some colonists wanted to settle the new territory they had helped to win during the 7 Years' War, but Great Britain made it illegal. London thought it was fairest and safest to reserve these lands for the Native Americans who had always lived and hunted there. George Washington agreed with plenty of other colonist settlers who thought the law unfairly limited their rights. They poured into the West anyway. So, what stirred up the hornet's nest in the first place? It all began over money, and over the rights of citizens, too. Great Britain had been in one war and another for 50 years and was drowning in debt. Over in London, Parliament decided that Americans should help out by paying their fair share, and King George agreed. After all, Great Britain had spent plenty of money fighting in America for the good of the colonists. The Crown was still supporting a British army to help stop Indian attacks on the American frontier. It was Great Britain's right to collect payment. To raise the money, Parliament passed a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act, saying that colonists had to pay taxes to Great Britain for all sorts of imported goods, from molasses, blue indigo dye, and pimentos to printed items such as marriage licenses, playing cards, and newspapers. Similar taxes were often collected in England, but the colonists were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts and to run the colonies. A lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. Besides, they believed it was against the British Constitution. Ever since the Middle Ages, English law had said that there should be no taxation without representation. This meant the colonists could never be taxed unless their elected representatives but voted to pay. The colonists were British colonists, and the law guaranteed them the right of Englishmen. So, where was their right to have representatives who could vote for or against these taxes? Though many colonies would stay loyal to the Crown and obey its laws no matter what, others argued that Parliament might make them pay even more taxes without their consent. Many colonist merchants refused to buy British goods. Pamphlet writers roared. Preachers thundered from their pulpits. Angry members of an organization called the Sons of Liberty stripped royal office holders naked and covered them with hot tar and goose feathers. They used to tar and feather folks in Great Britain too in those days. A mob completely wrecked the home of the royal governor of Massachusetts. A straw dummy dressed to look like a stamp distributor was hung from a 120-year-old elm tree, and the British tax stamps that Americans were supposed to buy were burned in every colony. By the time the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect in November of 1765, flags were being flown at half-mast to mourn the death of liberty. Nobody in America would even distribute the stamps. 4 months later, hoping to restore peace, Parliament finally gave up and got rid of the hated taxes. The troubled King George, who still thought the taxes were fair, but he signed the repeal anyway. British merchants were delighted to get their lost customers back, and all of America celebrated. Well, the story could have ended right there, but of course it didn't. To show they weren't afraid to tax the colonies, Parliament started demanding even more taxes. Patriotic leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia asked politely, but politeness didn't help one bit. King George believed that God gave him, noblemen, the divine right to rule and that the colonists had a duty to obey. The British stubbornly informed legislators in both colonies that they couldn't have any more meetings, so the colonists stopped trying to be polite. The Virginians, including George Washington, met anyway and banned the sale of all items taxed by Great Britain. Colonists smuggled in untaxed goods from other countries, which was illegal, and they made lots of their own goods instead of buying British ones. A women's group called the Daughters of Liberty supported the cause by weaving their own cloth, making their own ball gowns, and brewing their own Liberty tea out of sassafras flowers. King George was sure that certain gentlemen who pretended to be patriots in Massachusetts were no more than criminals, so he sent a fleet of warships to Boston to make them behave. 700 soldiers wearing fancy uniforms soon paraded up. Boston streets were muskets on their shoulders. Whenever they went off duty, many stole, got drunk, and chased women. Some also inflated workships by purposefully racing boats, beating drums, and gambling under church windows on Sundays. In March 1770, an angry mob of American rowdies started taunting 8 of King George's soldiers and pelting them with ice snowballs. Then someone threw a lump of wood at a redcoat and knocked him flat. Then enraged troops began firing into the crowd, and 5 colonists were killed. Furious Sons of Liberty were quick to label the disaster the Boston Massacre, and it stirred up plenty of anger on both sides. It just so happened that on the very same day as the violence in Boston, Parliament and King George over in London were trying to keep peace. They got rid of all import taxes except for one tiny tax on British tea. They thought that would solve the problem, but it didn't. Lots of colonists represent paying any British taxes, no matter how tiny. It was a matter of principle. Some refused to drink British tea and drank tea smuggled from Holland instead. Others, including George Washington, stopped drinking tea altogether. By 1773, the British East India Company had so much unsold tea sitting around that it was about to go broke. To keep this tea company in business, Great Britain's Prime Minister, Lord North, proclaimed that absolutely nobody except for the East India Tea Company could sell any tea in America. To convince colonists to buy tea, prices were set so low that even with tea taxes, the company's tea cost less than any other tea sold in England or in America. The colonists loved tea, but most of them still thought this was taxation without representation. British tea either rotted in warehouses or got sent straight back to England. Before long, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, declared that unless the tax was paid, none of the tea shipped to Boston Harbor could be sent anyway. If the tea was not unloaded, ships' commanders would force it on shore under the cover of their cannon's mouth. On the night of December 16th, 1773, some Sons of Liberty covered their faces and hands with coal dust, disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, and very calmly filled on board 3 ships filled with tea. Hundreds gathered to watch as the men split open 342 chests of British Darjeeling tea with tomahawks and fed all 45 tons of it to the fish. Most British were outraged when they heard news of the wanton destruction. Americans were clearly a race of convicts. They had gone too far and must be punished. 6 months later, the king and an angry parliament closed Boston Harbor. Nothing could come in and nothing could go out.